Hey VCers, it's Matt. I hope everyone's doing alright tonight. I just happened to be up in the middle of the night, so thought I'd do a video and address the challenge that I sent out to everybody to name your favorite bands or artists of the decades from the 1920s up to this decade. I've had, I think 4 people have made videos answering that so far, and everybody's done a great job. Adam Lee did a really good one. Jorgen S. did a lot of jazz and a lot of music that I'm not familiar with. I wrote down some of the names to look into some of the people he was talking about. His was surprised me that the girl from ABBA actually made solo albums in the 60s before ABBA came about. I wasn't aware of that, so I'd kind of like to hear that, see what she was all about. Don't know how easy those are to find here in America, but and of course, Bobby Gass has outdone himself and gone above and beyond with his series of videos. He's made 3, I believe, so far, 3 of them, going through the decades of his favorite music. So, really great stuff. Check that out, and I'm looking forward to your installments upcoming there, Bobby. So, yeah, the challenge is I hope some more people do this. Basically, go from the 1920s to now, and for each decade, name your really however many you want to, but uh, 3 to 5 to whatever your favorite bands or artists of that decade. I mean, I guess keep it within reason. I don't know if you want to get on here and do your top 50 from each decade, but if you want to, go ahead and go for it. But uh, I was thinking in the 3 to 10 range, maybe. I don't know. Doesn't really matter how many you do, but your favorite band and/or artist of each decade. And of course, as I've said before, if you don't know music from the 20s or the 40s or whatever, you don't have to worry about that. You can just start wherever you want to. Start in the 60s, start in the 80s, start this decade wherever you want to start. But just kind of a, you know, your taste of music through the decades there. So yeah, I'll do mine. The 1920s, which I don't have a very much from, but we'll start with Louis Armstrong, kind of the pioneer of jazz there. This is with the Hot Fives and Sevens. Of course, he was active through several decades, but the 20s is the start, and that's some of his best stuff. Only have that on CD, don't have it on album. So that's my 20s entry. I have one other. This was a record store day find a few years back. Charlie Poole and the Highlanders, complete Paramount and Brunswick recordings from 1929. Not much of a country fan, but this is actually kind of old timey, like "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou" type music. It's fun stuff. I enjoy that. Don't know if I'm gonna seek out anything else by these guys, but that's a good album I've got a lot of enjoyment out of. So that's cool stuff. Other than that, I've got on my iPod some old 20s music, but I don't have any other records or CDs or anything. But some of the people, Jimmy Rogers, Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, Bix Beiderbecke is really great. I would like to get some stuff by him. Hoagie Carmichael was around back then. Sophie Tucker, Charlie Patton, old blues guy. And so, yeah, I like that music when I hear it. That old, the way it sounds and everything. Some of the people sound like they're singing with a clothespin on their nose. And so it's good stuff. I like that old 20s music. But as far as physical things, I only have those 2 there. So the 30s, I've got, and it's CD only, unfortunately. But kind of the Elvis of blues music, Robert Johnson, the Legend of the Crossroads, and all that. Maybe y'all have heard of that. Definitely worth checking out. He only made, I don't know, maybe about 40 songs in his lifetime that he recorded, that is. But highly influential and worth checking out. I have Count Basie was active in the 30s. I like him, but I don't have anything by him. This guy was active in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Big Bill Broonzy, one of my favorite blues singers. He died in 1958. This is actually a concert, a live concert. He's from America, but this is a live concert in Germany from 1951, which I know we're talking about the 30s, but he was active in the 30s. He's one of the early purveyors of Chicago blues, and he's kind of the bridge between that pre-war acoustic blues and going into electric blues. Big, huge influence on all the blues guys like Muddy Waters and B.B. King and so forth. Big, huge influence on people like Eric Clapton and Jimmy Page and Keith Richards. I think Eric Clapton and Keith Richards and some of those guys might have actually seen him in England when he did concerts back in the 50s. They would have been high school age kids at the time and not famous yet. But he's a really good, worth checking out. He's kind of been forgotten in the mix because he died in 1958 and didn't get to realize the benefits of the sort of the blues boom after bands like the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds kind of popularized that stuff in the 60s. So he's right up there with Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, B.B. King, any of those guys. Big Bill Broonzy, worth checking out. So that goes the 30s. The 40s. All right. Speaking of Muddy Waters, and this is a later album in the 40s, but Muddy Waters, folk singer, he was a big blues influence there in the 40s. Sister Rosetta Tharpe, and of course you've got Bing Crosby and Sinatra were active in the 40s. This is a 60s Sinatra album, but Watertown's one of Sinatra's best. Kind of an overlooked. This is a late 60s album. Actually, sort of a little bit of a concept album, but brilliant. One of his best albums, Watertown by Sinatra. So that'll do the 40s, I think. Yeah, Sister Rosetta Tharpe was a heck of a guitar player and a great gospel singer. So we come up to the 1950s. Got to get this guy in here somewhere, even though he was active in several decades. But Miles Davis, I'm not a huge jazz guy just because there's a lot about it that I don't have many jazz records and a lot that I don't know. But the good stuff is as good as anything, and he's one of the good ones. So what you're thinking more along the lines of 1950s, of course, you've got this guy, one of the best. Doesn't really need an introduction. Another one of the 50s. Can't do without Buddy Holly. And I'll put this guy in the 50s just because that's where he started, even though he ran through several decades, but he's one of the best of all time, so you can't. And I've got a couple of James Brown albums on vinyl I should have pulled out, but I pulled these CDs out because if you can find them, I think they're still around. They are worth the money. These are all of it's a limited edition thing. I don't know if that shows up, but these are all of his singles starting from 1956 to 60 is the first volume, and most of them are just 1 year. This is 64 to 65. They go up through 1980, 1979 or 80, and I think there's about 12 or so in the set. Definitely worth getting if you just know Papa's Got a Brand New Bag or Cold Sweat, and that's all the James Brown you know. There's a whole lot of some of the best music ever made in that, so check that out. What else in the 50s? We got, I didn't pull anything by Elvis, but obviously Elvis, and got some vinyl on this guy too, but this is his, started out as a gospel singer, the Complete Soul Stirs records with Sam Cooke, and then of course he went off solo and went into secular and pop music and soul music, but Sam Cooke essential as anybody. So He was in the 50s and, of course, in the 60s too until he died. 1960s we come to, and I'm going to surprise everybody here. Well, obviously. And another obviously. Can't do without Otis. And yet another obviously. And anyone who's been watching my videos lately knows that the Kinks, my second favorite band of all time. Also in the 60s, I'll put them up there as good as anybody. One of my favorite bands of all time too, so Shangri-Las. And they had a lot of great songs other than just their radio hits, so definitely worth checking out. And I always had a little crush on her, so, you know. But great music on top of that. And Sly and the Family Stone. You can't do without Sly and the Family Stone. And that'll do it for the 60s. I mean, it's hard to narrow the 60s down to just, what is that, 6 artists, because there's just such a wealth and bumper crop of brilliant, great music that, I mean, what did I, Hendrix, Bob Dylan, The Who, the Yardbirds, the Animals, Paul Revere and the Raiders, just goes on and on and on. Love, Moby Grape. I could go on all day, but I'll just go with those selections that I showed, and we will move on to the 1970s. Let's see here. Best funk and soul band of the 70s, also the best rock and roll band of the 70s. Take their first 4 or 5 albums and put them up against any white guy rock and roll, and they hold their own and blow them away. Just a brilliant band. Their first 6 or so albums are totally essential. Funkadelic, great stuff. And another 70s band that you shouldn't be without. German rock, Krautrock, Can. Great band. One of the best albums of that decade. Another choice. I always think of these as an 80s band, these next 2 selections, but they actually did most of the bulk of their work was done in the 70s. But so the Clash, which I pull an 80s album to represent the Clash in the 70s, but anyway, you know, there's that thing about London Calling, is it a 70s or an 80s album, because it was released in December 79 in England and January 80 in America. But so their first 3 albums came out in the 70s, and then they had a couple of albums, really. Not going to count Cut the Crap, because that's without most of the band. But anyway, so the Clash, yeah, one of the best bands ever, and I'll put them in the 70s. This other band, too, is my 3rd favorite band of all time, and this is actually an album that they released in the 70s. It's 1979 Setting Sun by The Jam. I always kind of think of them as an 80s band, but they're actually most of their work in the 70s. So, brilliant album too. Pick that up. So that does the 70s, and of course there's tons of other stuff that Curtis Mayfield, Led Zeppelin, and there's a bunch of stuff, but I'll just leave it at that. So the 80s, we go to you've heard me talk about these guys before, Dexy's Midnight Runners. They're way more than just Come On Eileen. Worth checking out. Great band. Have every one of their albums is worth picking up. Prince belongs in here, and I forgot to pull a Prince album, so Prince, obviously. And I put the Cars down. I like the Cars, so they're kind of a 70s, 80s band too, but you think of them more as an 80s band. And I make no apologies. I love the Go-Go's, so they go in there. One of my favorite bands of the 80s. So now we move to what the 80s we did. We moved to the 90s. I hate the '90s, the worst musical decade ever. I couldn't really think of anything. It was it's landfill. The only thing I could come close to is Slater Kinney. They have some good stuff. They never really made a solid, great album. Maybe their last couple albums were about as close as they got, but they had some good stuff. And Blur had a few good songs. They had a lot of garbage songs, but they had a few good songs. And man, I'm sorry, man. I know there's a lot of people that love '90s music, but that's all I can think of. I had nothing else out of that decade that I liked. It was a miserable decade. So we'll skip over that, and we will go to the 2000s, which was not much better than the '90s, but a little bit. I put down the White Stripes. I liked them when they came out. Kind of got tired of them pretty quick. I think I just liked them because for the first time in years, someone was making actual something that sounded like music to my ears again. They're okay. Their first few singles and their first what 3 albums are not bad. I don't really play them anymore, but I don't dislike them. So I'll put them down there. They're all right. They got old pretty quick though. Uh, their album that made them really big, Elephant, never did like that. Calexico, this is a great band that I do like from the 2000s. I think they actually started in the '90s, but sort of a mix of not so much rock and roll music. They music that sounds like film soundtrack stuff, like spaghetti westerns, and mixed with kind of Tejano uh, world music. I don't know. Hard to explain, but a good band worth checking out. This is a Record Store Day album of them live. It's taken from a couple of concerts. But Calexico, definitely worth checking out if you like film music, sounding stuff, etc. So we are up to. Oh, I did want to honorable mention from the 2000s. Eels, uh, Blinking Lights, and Other Revelations. It's a great album. This is one of my favorite albums of that decade, and this is the box set of the vinyl version of this record. It's a limited edition thing. It's actually autographed by the lead singer guy. But I love this album. But I've heard other stuff by the Eels, and I don't hate it, but I don't love it. It's not the rest of this stuff's not that good for. Anyway, so the 2010s, the 20 teens, and these are both my favorite albums of the last 30 years, I'd say. Raphael Saadiq, this is Stone Rollin', his latest album, but he's got a couple albums, really, he's got more than a couple, but solo, he's got 3 albums, I think, worth checking out, all of them. I think he is at work on a new album. Just soul music that sounds fresh and new. Doesn't sound like he's just trying to do the old, be like an old soul singer from the '70s or the '60s. Has that sound to it, but it also has a freshness and has his own imprint on it. One of the best albums of the last. You'd have to go back to 1985 to find a better album. And you've heard me talk about a million times. My favorite album of the year still, Lydia Loveless, Greatness. Everybody needs to rush out and buy this album today if you haven't already. So there's my choices. It's not as big a production and impressive as Bobby Gass's videos with the video clips and all that. But anyway, hope everybody makes their responses. Like to see everybody else's choices. And good night, everybody.